I mean, we don't have to look any further in the past than just, a year and a half ago when we saw John Magufuli, who was trying so hard and successfully, getting control of his nickel, which is, Elon Musk said that nickel is one of the most, you know, um, one of the most needed things for EV batteries is nickel. There's
Yeah.
several kilograms of nickel in every battery. And Magufuli, it wasn't right away. He was elected in 2015, and he was so liked in Tanzania at first that CNN and BBC, everyone celebrated this. They even CNN even reported that there was a new word in the Tanzanian lexicon called Magufulify, and it was to I have it over here. It was to render or declare an action cheaper or faster and deprive public officials of their capacity to enjoy life at the taxpayer's expense. So all the way in Tanzania, thousands of miles away in the US, CNN is talking about how much Tanzania likes their new president because he's getting rid of corruption. He's changing the country. And then slowly but surely, he was getting rid of too much corruption. He was changing the country too much. He got rid of a few Gates-funded GMO projects and kicked Gates out of the country, and he ended up actually outlawing GMO production because it was all Western technology in the country for good. And then the pandemic happened, and he refused to buy the vaccines from COVAX. He talked bad about the PCR test. He didn't believe that it was too useful in detecting coronavirus.
Didn't he stage a kind of public stunt to mock the PCR test where he would?
Yes, yeah, no, on state television, they did a COVID test on I think it was a pawpaw, which is like a fruit, and a goat, and motor oil, and they all came back positive. And he was like, "Listen, we're not going to shut down the economy because of these tests. They obviously aren't working correctly." And the Western media did not like that. And on top of that, during the same time, he was nationalizing his green, quote unquote, green mineral wealth in the country. And he actually signed a law that discounted and ended any past mineral contract with a mining giant before he became president. So he had full reign to rewrite the contract. And he also fined Barrick and Acacia, which are two Western mining giants, billions of dollars, $190 billion in some cases, for not paying their taxes and for poisoning Tanzanian waterways. So they were really, really upset with him. And they have the biggest nickel deposit in the world in Tanzania. And so there's tons and tons of Western mining giants who wanted to get their hands on this, and they knew how important it was for this, green electrification and the fourth industrial revolution, where everything has to be digitized. And it was this nationalization where he forced these companies to have partnerships with the government, the federal government. And if they didn't want to, they have to leave. He was really nationalist. And, we would see these articles coming out while this was happening. Oh, this guy is crazy. He's too Tanzania first. Even the Center for Strategic, what is it?
CSIS.
Yes. They mentioned, they obviously don't like him. And they mentioned he's liked by Tanzanians because he says that his country was taken advantage of by imperialists since they gained their independence. And
this is a intelligence-tied think tank in Washington, very connected to the Pentagon, the intelligence apparatus, and here they are basically putting a target on Magufuli's back.
And so he's doing all these things that go against the World Economic Forum and Western mining interests and corporations, and also during the pandemic, all those pharmaceutical interests, and he didn't shut down his country, and then he was reported missing, and then he was reported dead. I'm not saying he was offed or assassinated, but it is interesting when, you have an African leader doing all these things against the interests of the United States and Western corporations simply disappear and die in the middle of his, policy changes.
To talk more about that, he's said to have died of a heart attack, but he disappeared. It was very mysterious.
He was supposedly missing for about 2 weeks, and then they were like, okay, he had a heart attack, and then the media couldn't really get their story straight. It was he had a heart attack, but he had COVID. And while this was happening, his main political opponent in the country, who used to work for the World Resources Institute, which is a giant, green energy lobbying firm, mining lobbying firm, was saying when he was still alive, supposedly was saying he's dead, putting out all of this misinformation. So the whole thing was a very interesting saga where it ended with his passing, and his vice president was put into power. She's since allowed Western mining corporations more control than Magufuli did, which is, I guess, not surprising, which is unfortunate for the Tanzanian people. And she also brought in Tony Blair to be their special assistant envoy on climate change mitigation, which includes which mining interests, which is an interesting, he dies and then they bring in, the biggest hawk, Tony Blair. So it's a sad story.
And the Magufuli's president also had some relationship with Bill Gates. Am I right about that?
Yeah, no, she comes from the UN. And while she was at the UN, she did give money and take money from the Gates Foundation and enact a few partnerships between, food initiatives and the Gates Foundation. And then she became the president after the current president was kicking out Gates. So it's all very interesting timing.
Yeah. So here you have the CSIS again, this spook think tank in Washington. 1 year of Tanzanian President Hassan. What's changed? And here you can see her getting the jab, getting the mRNA jab. On
television, as soon as he died.
As soon as he died, she's kind of like, we're going to be injected with lots of foreign investment. So, marks the 1 year anniversary of Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu's Hassan's inauguration, and her, they're clearly celebrating her. They're saying, how would President Hassan handle Tanzania's reputational fallout from 5 years of Magufuli's autocratic rule? Meaning his reputation among CSIS and people funded by Bill Gates and the Tony Blair Institute, because his reputation in Tanzania compared to any other African presidents was practically peerless. His approval rating was massive. He was a national hero.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see them say autocratic rule when you have BBC, the second year of Magufuli's presidency, saying that Magufuli has a 96% approval rating. I mean, that's crazy, and that's coming from Western media. So to say it was autocratic is it just doesn't line up with what the Western media said before.
And a number of African leaders died early on in the pandemic of mysterious deaths who were not going along with the program. Is that correct?
Yeah, we had deaths, and we also had people driven from power and replaced with either someone else in a different party in their country. But I believe it was Burundi. Am I correct?
Burundi.
Yeah. So you had Tanzania's Magufuli, you had Burundi. These were the two countries, I believe, on the entire continent that didn't order any COVID vaccines from Bill Gates's COVAX. So the fact that the two presidents that didn't order any vaccines from COVAX, died. Unfortunately, they passed away, whether it was a heart attack or whether it was COVID, within the same, half a year, when there aren't many deaths of presidents in Africa going back or going forward since then. It's definitely interesting timing. It's something to think about.
Yeah, it is. And Eritrea, also a target of the U.S. empire, target of an invasion. I'm not saying the invasion has anything to do with it, but it never enacted a mass vaccination program at all or around COVID, following the wishes of its citizens. And that's consistent with just Eritrea's general position on issues like foreign debt, avoiding getting in bed with the IMF and maintaining independence. And I was going to pull up a New York Times article just because it was kind of like the perfect epilogue to the whole Magufuli saga, which is that Africa is experiencing low COVID death rates and no one knows why. They're doing very well without having engaged in lockdowns and mandates and mass vaccination. Kind of an article that all of the hysterical professional left-wing activists who were howling about vaccine apartheid and basically being
vaccine equity, vaccine apartheid. This was a very interesting time on the left, where you had these supposed self-proclaimed anti-imperialists and leftists saying that these countries in Africa, they need to be injected with this highly profitable product that's made by a Western corporation that's broken the law, hundreds of times.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting and unfortunate time in political discourse. But you had these countries, we heard vaccine equity and vaccine apartheid, but in the countries, you were seeing, country after country, they would finally get their vaccines from COVAX, or they would get their COVID aid, which included vaccines, and they would open up their vaccine centers, and they would say, there are nurses or people who give the vaccine sitting idle with no patients. The people in Africa, I'm not going to speak for all African people, but there are many, many nations in Africa where they had vaccine access, but there was literally no demand or uptake.
Yeah. And then you had Martinique, a French colony in the Caribbean, actually stage an armed rebellion against Macron's vaccine mandate. Vaccine centers were burned there. French special forces were called in. For some reason, the left took no interest in this anti-colonial rebellion.
These people were like, they were into like QAnon or something.
Yeah. Well, that's what French liberals said about them. They they tried to compare them to DeSantis's Florida. And I think they had some racist term for them in France, like black rednecks, because they wouldn't go along with it. Here's science.org. The pandemic appears to have spared Africa so far. Scientists are struggling to explain why. Meanwhile, you had these groups like the Progressive International with their beautiful Helvetica website calling for vaccinating everyone in Africa in order to end the pandemic. They didn't understand how science works. So
here in New York, just to add this, to close the conversation, they had die-ins in front of Pfizer, where they said, free the vaccines, free the patents, give the vaccines to all these countries in Africa. And they would just lay dead in front of Pfizer saying, it was very anti-revolutionary, but they thought it was, the most progressive cause. It was send vaccines to Africa, even though that they don't have any liability and that they haven't been tested and this and that. Just give them to Africans because that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, without asking them if they wanted them, and so no one knew. Exactly. No one seemed to know the cautionary tale of John Magufuli or why he was popular. And
we're still talking about this. We're talking about Magufuli, 18 months after it happened, and it's still interesting. It was, it's almost like people have a, that it's in the middle of a war almost. Like we had a revolutionary African mysteriously die during COVID and nobody blinked, especially on the left. And so we're talking about it now months later. But when it actually happened, it was really not a peep from the people who you would think would be all over that.
It was shocking. And so one of the few really good articles was produced by you and Whitney Webb about John Magufuli at this time. I recommend everyone read it. At Unlimited Hangout, Tanzania's late President Magufuli, science denier or threat to empire? And, as you point out, along with all of the challenges he put to the quote unquote science, which has been revealed as scientism and largely discredited, he was challenging one of the most important industrial projects on the African continent being put forward by multinational corporations, which is mining for these minerals. And they go hand in hand. The mineral mining, the COVID hysteria, it all comes together at the World Economic Forum. This is all part of the same agenda of controlling minerals and also controlling humanity and our behavior and our biology, to merge it with the digital. And the African challenge to this, as you said, was ignored or actually denigrated in the left. I saw some left-wing activists sharing a Wall Street Journal article smearing Magufuli.
Mm-hmm. You know, it was everywhere. I mean, it was, you know, we said science denier. Like, I mean, obviously it rhymes with empire, and that worked out. But because he was being framed as a science denier on the left, because science denier is it's a great phrase for them to throw around on anyone who doesn't get down with the entire, ruling class, game, whether it's, stopping climate change through the mass, colonization and neo-colonization of Africa, or, stopping COVID through record, pharmaceutical profits. And if you don't get down with those, you're a science denier, even if you're a revolutionary president in Africa on the left.
Yeah.